Hey there, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and today I am recording a Q&A solo episode answering a few questions that I got on Instagram. So before we dive into the questions today, if you're enjoying this podcast, if you're taking value away from it, it would be super, super helpful if you could go ahead and leave a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. That helps us to spread the word about the show. It helps us to grow in iTunes and get more people to see the show and be able to listen to it and watch it on YouTube and all that jazz. So that'd be super helpful. And of course, if you know anybody that you think would be interested in the show, please feel free to share it out to them or share it on social media as well. That all helps to spread the word. All right, without further ado, let's get into the questions for today. All right, the first question today, what is the best way to determine energy spent or determine energy expenditure? Okay, so before we answer this question, or before I answer this question, I do want to just kind of bring you through what energy expenditure is composed of, because this is something that a lot of people tend to get confused on, and I thought it would be a good time, especially with this question being asked, to kind of dive into what our energy expenditure is composed of, right? And it's also referred to as our TDEE. So if you ever see TDEE anywhere, that just stands for total daily energy expenditure. And it's basically the number of calories that you burn on a daily basis. And so this can be broken down into 4 components, which I'm going to go into in a second. If you think about if you've ever seen the calorie balance equation, you've probably seen a picture of like a scale and it's calories in versus calories out. That in itself is a whole podcast. We could go into detail on that, but we're not going to do that today. Basically, if you see that, the calories outside of the equation, all of that is what our TDEE is. Our total daily energy expenditure is the calories outside of the equation. So just to kind of reference that, if you've viewed that before, that gives you a better picture of what I'm talking about here. So it's made up of 4 components, like I mentioned. And the first component, which is the biggest part of our TDEE, is our basal metabolic rate, also referred to as BMR. Some people also refer to this as RMR. They're slightly different, but in this context, they're pretty much the same thing. So if you ever see, BMR or RMR, BMR stands for basal metabolic rate, RMR stands for resting metabolic rate. They're not exactly the same thing, but in this context, we're just going to kind of refer to them as the same thing because people use them interchangeably. So our BMR, basal metabolic rate, or resting metabolic rate, it makes up about 60 to 70% of our total daily energy expenditure. So basically, our BMR is the number of calories that your body burns just to stay alive. So literally, if you were just to sit on the couch all day and not move, you would burn calories, and that would be your calories at rest. So that would be calories burned at rest, which is your BMR. And your BMR is mostly influenced by your body size. So the heavier you are, the higher your BMR will be. The lighter you are or the less you weigh, the less your BMR will be. So this is one thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that your BMR is mostly influenced just by your body weight, right? So it can also be influenced by, hormonal status, dieting history, different genetic factors, your health status, things like that. But your body size is going to be the majority of what influences your BMR. And if we can realize that, and that is about 60 to 70% of our total daily energy expenditure, that is probably the one component out of the 4 that doesn't change much unless you lose a bunch of weight or you gain a bunch of weight, which can be the case. But even with that, it still doesn't change significantly. It does change a little bit if you are, like I said, if you are the heavier you are, the higher your BMR typically will be. But in the grand scheme of things, it's still only It's one of those variables that doesn't change much compared to the other ones that do. So let's dive into the other components. So that would be number one, and that makes up about 60 to 70% of your energy expenditure, your total daily energy expenditure. The second one, and these aren't in a particular order. Obviously, the BMR is the biggest, so that one went first. The second one that I'm going to talk about is the thermic effect of exercise. This you'll probably see referred to as TEE. It's also referred to as exercise activity thermogenesis, or EAT. So if you see TEE or EAT, they mean the same thing. It's basically the amount of calories that you burn during formal exercise. So anything where you're doing formal exercise. So if you're lifting weights, you're doing cardio, like formal cardio, you're running, you're doing an exercise class, you're playing basketball or whatever it may be, anything that's considered exercise or formal exercise, that is categorized into the component of TEE or EAT. So thermic effect of exercise or exercise activity thermogenesis, basically the amount of calories you burn when you're doing formal exercise. And for most people, this makes up about 5% of their TDEE. That can even go up to 10% if you are like an elite athlete or you're more active. So we say about 5 to 10% is TEE, thermic effect of exercise. So the next component, so that was two of the components out of the four. The next one is the thermic effect of food or digestion. And so this makes up about 10 to 15% of your TDEE. And this is just referred to as the calories burned during digestion. So the thermic effect of food, which is what I just mentioned, you might see this referred to as TEF. It's just, the letters, thermic effect of food, TEF, is a measure of how much different foods increase energy expenditure due to the energy required to digest, absorb, and metabolize the nutrients within that food. So it takes energy to digest food, and the amount of energy it takes is influenced by the macronutrient makeup of a particular food, and then also how processed a food is versus, how unprocessed it is. So I'll talk about that in a second, but chatting towards the macronutrient part of things first. So each macronutrient, we know that the macronutrients are carbs, fats, and protein, and then we also have alcohol, but we're not going to include that in this discussion. But your general macronutrients are obviously carbs, fats, and protein, and they each go through a different metabolic process in your body in order to be broken down and used for energy. So some of these metabolic processes are actually more efficient than others. And if you think about it, the more efficient a process is at breaking down a particular food, the more of the food's energy is going to be used or stored, right? And the less efficient, the more energy or calories are going to be lost as heat. So if we just break this down a little bit further, basically the higher the thermic effect of food, the less efficient the process is going to be, and the more energy it's going to take to metabolize that food. And therefore, the more heat is going to be generated, or you can always think of this as the more quote unquote calories are going to be burned in the process. So just think about it. The more efficient you are at digesting a food, the more is actually going to be used or stored. And the less efficient you are, the more is going to be kind of burned during the process, or heat is generated during the process is like the scientific stuff that happens. So this is referred to as the thermic effect of food. And like I said, different macronutrients have different macronutrients have different percentages for how efficient they are. So if we break down the thermic effect of food for each macronutrient, fat has about 0 to 3% TEF, carbs have about 5 to 10% TEF, and protein has about 20 to 30% TEF. So if you've listened to this podcast at all in the past, you know that I'm a huge fan of protein. And this is one of the reasons, especially if we're thinking about protein, when we're talking about, changing your body composition in the sense of losing body fat. If you're not on top of your protein, you're doing yourself a disservice because you're actually burning calories in the digestion of that protein. So with protein having a much higher thermic effect than fats and carbs, it's going to require much more energy to metabolize than fats and carbs. So basically, the higher the protein content of the food you're eating, the more of a metabolic advantage you will have. And that just means that the more inefficient your body is at basically breaking down that protein. So the more, like, you're going to obviously absorb some, but you're also going to lose some as heat, and you're going to be burning it off during the digestion process. So again, fat has a thermic effect of food of 0 to 3%, carbs have a thermic effect of food of 5 to 10%, and protein has a thermic effect of food of 20 to 30%. So that is kind of the macronutrient side of thermic effect of food. And then the other side of thermic effect of food that a lot of people don't realize or don't think about is that we break down whole foods and processed foods a little bit different as well. So if you think about it practically, whole foods actually require more energy to digest than processed foods. And the reason for that, again, if you think about this practically, is because processed foods are actually already broken down to a certain degree. So when you eat them, they're already processed. That's what the word means, processed, broken down. So when you eat them, your body actually is more efficient at, absorbing that food and the nutrients and whatever in that food. So it's going to basically not release as much, right? So that's something to think about, that whole foods, right? The more you focus on whole foods, and this is why I drill this into my clients all the time, the majority of your food throughout the day should be made up of whole foods, because it actually takes, especially if your goal is fat loss, because it actually takes more energy to digest and absorb the whole foods versus the processed foods. So whole foods, I always say, just think if it grew from the earth at some point or it had a face at some point, then it's probably considered a whole food. Not that your entire diet has to be whole foods. I'm not saying that, but if you look at your day, I always, tell my clients this, look at your day. And if at least 80% of your day is made up of whole foods that have either had a face at some point or grown from the earth at some point, then you're probably doing pretty well. If, 60% of your food is coming from boxes and packages and is highly processed, and you are struggling to lose body fat, if that's your goal, then that's probably one of the first things that I would think about, because it's just merely switching out the types of foods you're eating and then also potentially upping your protein intake. And just that can actually help make a big difference over time. And so, like I said, the thermic effect of food makes up about 10 to 15% of your total daily energy expenditure. That might seem like just a small amount, which it is, but it can compound itself over time, right? So if we're thinking about more than just a day, if we're thinking about weeks and months and several months, right? That's going to add up over time. And so that's where we need to kind of think about that. And then the last component of your total daily energy expenditure is known as your NEAT, or your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This makes up between 15 to 25% of your TDEE. And so NEAT refers to the calories burned during activities that are not considered formal exercise. So these would be things like cleaning your house, walking your dog, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, standing for a period of time, fidgeting at your desk, just moving around your house, doing chores, gardening, things like that are, you're getting movement in, some type of movement, but it's not considered formal exercise. And a lot of people don't also realize that NEAT is the most controllable variable of that calories outside of the equation. I actually wrote a blog post on this a while back where I compared someone who was sitting at their desk for like an 8-hour workday versus someone who was standing at their desk for an 8-hour workday. And I kind of broke down the numbers. So definitely check out that blog post if you haven't already. I will link it in the show notes so you can check it out. It's also on my website, metflexlife.com, but I'll link the actual link. I always say that in the show notes so you can check that out. But those, or NEAT is, again, it's one of the most controllable variables of calories out, because it's something that you can pay attention to. It's something that I pay attention to with all of my clients, and we really track that with having a step goal. And that's a huge component that a lot of people miss out on, especially if the goal is fat loss, like I mentioned. it's also part of just overall health, right? We need to make sure that we're moving and we're not sedentary, and having a step goal can be super helpful for that. So I know that doesn't answer the original question. I'm going to get to that in a second, but I thought that this would be a great time to kind of break that down and help you understand where that energy expenditure side of things comes from and what it's made up of. Because it tends to be a confusing topic. So the 4 components added together are what make up your total daily energy expenditure. So just to reiterate, your BMR or RMR plus your thermic effect of exercise plus your thermic effect of food, and then plus your NEAT or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Those are the 4 components. And when you add those all up, that is what your total daily energy expenditure is. Okay, so getting back to the actual question, what is the best way to determine energy spent or your energy expenditure? So this is something that is actually very, very hard to get one specific number on what your TDEE is. The reason for this is because it's actually going to be a little bit variable day to day, depending on, different lifestyle factors and different things that you're doing throughout the day. So it's always going to be, a little bit variable during the day, especially person to person, but within the same person, it's going to be a little bit variable. There is a way that you can definitely estimate your total daily energy expenditure. And this would simply be by using an online calculator. There's so many out there that estimate your TDEE. One of the ones that's very popular, and I will link it in the show notes, it's literally tdeecalculator.net. And you'll basically put in all your information and it will calculate what your total daily energy expenditure is. And it will give you a place to start. And the reason I say a place to start is because it's just an estimate. It can be completely off depending on the values that you put in. There are so many different variables that, play into that. And so I would say the best way to determine your energy spent is, one, if you want to use that equation to get a starting kind of general estimate, that would be a good place to start. But really, if you really want to figure out, what your TDEE is, it's going to be tracking your metrics over time, right? And so you can think about your total daily energy expenditure being kind of the amount of calories that it's actually basically your maintenance calories, right? So how many calories you're eating to be able to maintain your current body size and weight. That is going to be your maintenance intake or your maintenance range, because it's not just one static number. Like I said, it could be variable a little bit day to day because your TDEE will be a little bit variable day to day. But tracking your personal metrics and your body weight and your composition over a period of time to find your maintenance range is going to be your best bet, because once you know your maintenance range, then you can start to manipulate different factors depending on what your specific goal is, right? And so that is where, your energy outside of the equation comes in, is really that's really equal to your maintenance intake, right? So, and that's what most people want to know, right? What is the amount of calories I can consume to maintain my current body weight? And then once I know that range, then I can make adjustments up or down depending on if my goal is to lose weight or gain weight. And obviously, there's more to it than just calories in, calories out, but that is a big factor when it comes to obviously losing body fat or gaining body fat, is the amount of deficit that you're in or you're not, or the amount of surplus that you're in. And so that will be determined first. First, you have to determine what your maintenance is, right? And then you can adjust from there. So if you're interested in more details on that, I will link the episode that I went into detail about how to find your maintenance caloric intake. So it's episode 46 a while back, but I'll link that in the show notes, or you can just go to the podcast app wherever you listen and search for episode 46. It's called How to Find Maintenance Caloric Intake, Fast versus Slow Fat Loss, Accuracy of Tracking Devices, and more. And that dives into a lot more on finding maintenance, and also dives into different activity trackers. And if they're, if you wear an Apple Watch and you're doing a workout, or a Fitbit or something that gives you a calorie expenditure that you did during that workout, I talk all about in this episode if that is actually accurate or not. So definitely check out that episode if you're interested in that. But hopefully that gave you some insight into what your total, daily energy expenditure is made up of. So that educates you on, the things that you can focus on in the future, depending on what your goal is. Okay, the next question. Alternate day fasting with daily heavy workouts makes me feel less efficient. What should I do? Okay, so alternate day fasting also is, people refer to it as ADF, just stands for alternate day fasting. And it's literally what it says. You're fasting every other day. So there's one day that you're, like, say you're doing this throughout a weekly period, maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you're fasting, and then Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, potentially Sunday, you're feeding, or maybe you do like 4 fasts, 3 feedings, whatever. It's basically just alternating your days between fasting and feeding throughout a period of time. And this is pretty extreme for most people, doing like a full fasting day, and then an eating day, and then a full fasting day. There's also like different caveats to this. Some people do it differently, where they'll do like, on their fasting day, it won't be like a true, 0 calorie fast. It would be like a 500 calorie fast, or even like a PSMF day. So there's so many different ways to go about it. But typically alternate day fasting is pretty extreme for most people. It also depends on like why you're doing this, and if it's for a specific medical reason, or if you are, very overweight and you need to lose a significant amount of weight in a certain period of time for a medical or a health reason, then yes, it can be, a tool. But for most people, it is a little bit extreme. And then this question, if you're doing daily heavy workouts and you're doing daily workouts, I probably wouldn't recommend alternate day fasting, again, unless it's the only way that either you can adhere to what you're doing, or if it's for a specific health reason. So, just thinking about it practically, you're going to hinder your performance and your recovery if you don't have any fuel coming in. And you're also more likely to lose muscle mass, especially if you're not overweight, and you're doing this, you're like a leaner person, you're doing alternate day fasting. And especially if it is like a 24-hour full fast followed by, a non-fasting day, and then back to that 24-hour fast. If you just look at your total intake, at the end of the week, it's probably going to be like lower. It's probably much lower compared to obviously if you were to eat every day. And then if you're thinking about the activity that you're doing, and especially if your goal is to build muscle, like you're probably just not doing the best for yourself, because if you are constantly fasting, even, alternate day, your body's going to be in a catabolic state, right? So when we think about building muscle, we do want to be in an anabolic state or building state as much as possible if the goal is to build muscle. That just makes sense, right? We want our bodies to be as quote unquote anabolic as possible, so that we're not breaking down, muscle tissue. We're not breaking down, constantly. And that's where, just to define the words anabolism and catabolism, anabolism typically just means building up, and catabolism means breaking down. When you're in a fasting state, you're in a catabolic state. So you're breaking things down for energy, right? And so if you're constantly doing that and you're realizing that your workouts are not feeling good and you're feeling less efficient, then it kind of makes sense. You probably should just switch up what you're doing and start to eat a little bit more, start to fuel appropriately for your goals and for what you're doing. Because it's not just about the workout itself, but it's also about the recovery part of it. If you're not getting enough fuel in, especially protein, to recover from your workout and to give your muscles some, fuel to be able to build and repair, then you're just doing yourself a disservice. So that would be my answer to that question. Usually, if anything is, if you're noticing that it's hindering, whatever your main goal is, then it's probably time to switch things up. So hopefully that helped a little bit. All right, next question today. Why does my body change drastically throughout the day? Is it water weight? Okay, so it is pretty normal for your body to change a bit throughout the day, as you start to drink and eat and move more. A lot of people notice that they might wake up with maybe like a flat stomach or, a flatter belly. And then throughout the day, it tends to become not so flat. I know that's the case for me a lot of the time. And this is normal. This is just a normal part of your body, kind of going throughout the day, especially as you start to put things in it like food and hydration, and you start to move around and things like that. So one very common reason that your body could be changing drastically, as you mentioned, is One of the most common reasons is because of bloat that's occurring throughout the day. And this can be due to several different factors depending on the person. I actually recorded an entire episode that talks about the most common causes of bloating and how to remedy them. So I literally went through a whole list and kind of talked about, what each thing is and how to think about potentially remedying, is that a word? Remedying them? You get what I'm saying. So I will link that in the show notes. It's episode 52. If you're interested in just learning a little bit more about, bloating and kind of, trying to figure out what's happening for you personally, it's going to take some testing and assessing, but that episode should help you to start to dial in a few things. And it's probably due, it's probably due to a little bit of excess bloating that's occurring. Sorry, I'm losing my voice already. And there might be some things that you can start to focus on in terms of the types of foods you're eating, maybe that might not be agreeing with you, and some other factors as well. So definitely check out that episode 52. I'll link it in the show notes. All right, last question today. My son needs to run for his psyche, but wants to build muscle and resistance train. How should he go about mixing the two? Okay, this is a really good question. So the first thing I would say is that you definitely want to just make sure that you start off by educating him on all the benefits of building muscle and resistance training, because the more you can kind of drill into his mind all the different benefits that come from building muscle, especially, as he's younger and I'm assuming he's younger and he's growing up, and the more muscle he has, the better everything else is going to be down the line. That is probably the first thing that I would just make sure you're continuously doing, right? So that would mean educating yourself and then being able to educate your son on the benefits of building muscle. And then also, helping him come up with a game plan for how to structure his week so that he can work both in without overtraining. And this is something that it's important. I personally think it's important for, kids to have. I'm assuming he's a kid. I might be making the wrong assumption, but I think it's important for kids to be doing things that they enjoy. If he enjoys running, but he still wants to get into building muscle and resistance training, he can absolutely do both. It just comes down to structuring things so that it makes sense and so that he's not overdoing things and he's not under recovering. So maybe, you help him kind of set up a plan for the week just start with a week, right? And build from there. But maybe he dedicates like 3 to 4 days per week to resistance training, and then maybe 1 to 2, for running. Or maybe he gets in like a light run after one of his resistance training sessions or something like that. But the biggest thing is just make sure that he's also educated on the importance of recovery and why that matters overall. Because you definitely don't want him to overdo it. And that obviously could lead to injury and obviously not a good situation down the line. So that's probably where I would start, is just, again, educating him and just helping him come up with a game plan for what that looks like. And then once he starts seeing his muscles starting to grow and his body starting to change as he, hopefully gets on a good progressive program, he'll probably start to enjoy lifting more, and he'll move more towards that and want to do it more than maybe running. Not always the case, and definitely, not something that, like, running is great for some people and some people really enjoy it, and that's fine. But it all just depends on what his main goals are. But I have a feeling, and this is what I've seen with a lot of my clients and I see with a lot of people, is like, once they start to get into lifting weights, they start to see not just the body composition changes and the benefits that they're feeling, but they start to feel confident and empowered by it. That in itself will just kind of, lead them to want to do it a little bit more. And then the other things will start to kind of become like afterthoughts, really. But again, there's nothing wrong with running and lifting weights. You can definitely do both. You just have to kind of think about, okay, what's the main goal, and what is going to be the most, what are you going to be able to adhere to most and enjoy most? And just kind of, if that's both resistance training and running, then you just have to figure out how to combine those both so that it makes sense for your schedule or your son's schedule and makes sense from a recovery standpoint. So again, biggest part of this is just going to make sure that you are continuing to educate him on the benefits of what he's doing and potentially the drawbacks as well. So if you tend to see that he's overdoing it with both of these things and he's not giving himself enough time to rest and recover, then that's going to be another piece of the puzzle that definitely needs to be addressed and and definitely needs to be kind of brought to the forefront for, making sure that he's educated on that side of things. So hopefully that makes sense. And that is all the questions we have today. I hope that you enjoyed the episode. I will definitely be answering some more questions in future episodes. I actually have a whole other list that I want to get to. So be on the lookout for more solo Q&A episodes coming, and then also tons of guest episodes coming out. And, as always, if you're enjoying the podcast, it would be really, really helpful if you could head over to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating and a review, just kind of a few sentences of, what you're enjoying about the show, and maybe anything that you learned from a specific episode. That would help give me feedback so that I can continue to provide you value. And then it also helps the show grow, which is awesome. So really appreciate it. And I will chat with you next time.